Welcome to episode 11 of Experts of the Americas, a video series led by the Adrian Arce Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. I am Camila Hernandez, and I am Assistant Director and Colombia Lead at the Center. Today, I am joined by Lina Torres, Director of Knowledge and Management and Strategy at Movilizatorio, a citizen participation and social innovation lab that promotes democracy, inclusivity, and peace in Colombia and other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, Lina.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
We're glad to have you. In recent years, and especially after the peace agreement referendum of 2016, where half of Colombians voted against the agreement and the other half voted in favor, there has been a widespread assumption that Colombia is extremely polarized. Lina, Movilizatorio recently conducted a study on polarization that produced very interesting findings, showing that public opinion in Colombia is perhaps less polarized than one would originally think. Tell us more about this study and why it is so important.
So we just finished the first phase of this research project, which we conducted in partnership with OSF, the Ford Foundation, and the Santo Domingo Foundation. In this research, we analyzed 2.6 million tweets and retweets and tried to understand the dynamics of polarization beyond that rumor or that idea that we are very, very polarized. We analyzed 6 of the most salient conversations, which are the peace agreement, the Venezuelan migration, climate change and environment, gender equality, social protest, and corruption. Those are the 6 topics that we analyzed. And what we realized through this study is that we are not as polarized or as generally polarized as people think, but there are some topics that create division, and there are some topics that actually allow us to create a common agenda. And we want to really emphasize on that, and is that there are chances of building a common vision of what we want in the future, and that's what we are presenting with this study.
That finding, I think it's extremely interesting, as you said, because we originally thought Colombia was divided in half, and this shows that not really. But there are some topics that continue to be polarizing, and I wanted to talk to you about that. So of the 6 topics, which one was the most polarizing and why?
So the most polarizing topic is definitely the peace agreement. What we identified through qualitative and quantitative analysis is that the peace agreement remains the most polarizing issue, and it has 2 nodes, 2 poles of the conversations that basically gather every opinion around the peace agreement. But very interestingly, what we found is that it's not between people in favor and against the peace process. The 2 nodes are against the peace process, but for different reasons. They all agree that the peace process was not very successful, but for different reasons. One side believes that it was because it gave too much space for the FARC guerrilla, and the other side thinks it wasn't as successful because it lacked in opportunities and spaces for the victims and for the FARC guerrilla. So that's a very interesting finding on the peace agreement. The less polarizing issue is environment and climate change. And this is, again, very, very promising because it shows that there is some consensus that Colombians want to protect our environment and our natural resources.
And of the other issues, of the 6 issues, we have the peace agreement and we have the environment, which is not polarizing. Peace agreement continues to be polarizing. There's issues kind of in the middle that could go either way.
Yeah, exactly.
Which ones are at risk of becoming polarized, and how do we prevent that?
So the issues at risk of becoming polarized are the social protest and Venezuela. Those are the most at risk, in which we find some indicators of, let's say, hate speech, of a division between fractions of the conversation. So those are the 2 topics at risk. There is another topic that is not polarized, which is the gender equality one. In that one, we find that is a small conversation with very proactive notes that sort of push forward an agenda, but are not necessarily polarized. And the corruption conversation is also one that is somehow polarizing, but it's not completely polarized. Actually, there is some common agreement that the government and the institutions are not doing enough to fight corruption. So Venezuela and social protests are the ones that we are sort of like looking after, because they might become very polarized.
And I want to go back to the Venezuela front. Colombia is the largest recipient of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, with nearly 2 million people from Venezuela in its territory. One would think that conversations on Venezuela would be dominated by either migration or xenophobia. Was that the case? Is that what you found?
So we found something very unexpected here. We also thought that there was some anti-immigration sentiment that would dominate the conversation. But we found on the completely unexpected that only 30% of the conversation is about the migration and the migrants. The rest of the conversation is used to discuss other topics: the health system, security, violence, like other topics. And Venezuela is like a cross-cutting conversation around others. And what we found is that it's also used as a token, or as a, let's say, theme to go against adversaries. So people often use the Venezuelan migration as like a common place to say these things are going bad, or we are becoming the next Venezuela, but it's not necessarily against migrants, which is also very important, because it's important to understand that there is not a widespread sentiment against Venezuelans, but we also warn that there is a risk of people using this conversation for political purposes, or for like reasons to divide Colombians.
And all of these topics, I think, have the risk of becoming politicized, and Colombia will have legislative and presidential elections next year. Do you think that the country will become more polarized because of the elections? And if so, around which issues? And is there any way to prevent that?
We learned with this research that the dynamics of polarization are very sensitive to what is happening in the ground at every moment. It's like a very unstable dynamic. There are some conversations that have systematically being polarized, like the peace process, for years and years. But there's also others that depend on the context. For example, social protest was one conversation that was very much polarized at the beginning of 2020, when people was actually out in the streets protesting. But when the quarantines and the pandemic became the most important issue in Colombia, then that conversation sort of vanished. So we see there is a context that affects polarization, but we also see that there are some stakeholders that could proactively polarize conversations. And we don't know which direction it's going to take, but we do know that what we need is citizens that are very much aware of how politicians can use the conversations to divide the country, and how we can all have a role in allowing or not allowing the conversations to become polarized. And here, the message is for the people in the electoral campaigns, for the opinion leaders in Colombia, but also to every citizen. We need to understand how polarization happens, how it's also manufactured to an extent, and how we can become an active part in stopping this chain of polarization by not allowing others to design these ideas that we don't have anywhere or any sort of common agenda. We do have a common agenda, and we can fight polarization from every side where we are. And what we want at Movilizatorio definitely is to create awareness with the politicians that are running in the next campaign, so they don't use this tool, because it's actually very detrimental for democracy. And in the long run, what we also show is that it's also detrimental for the political purposes of any candidate. When they need to rule a country, when the time comes, having a divided constituency is very negative for the purposes of like pushing forward an agenda.
I like what you just mentioned about, yes, it's detrimental for candidates in the future, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to rule the whole country.
Exactly.
And I would love to close the discussion with recommendations. You already mentioned that each of us have a role to play, not spreading the polarization and becoming informed about how it takes place. What other recommendations do you have for other sectors of the population?
So we created a set of recommendations for some particular elements in the ecosystem that are very important. There is one that we call the one that is at risk of becoming extinct, and is this nodes that serve as a touch point between nodes with different opinions. Those nodes allows people to connect on different ideas. And so we are really calling on the media and the opinion leaders that have like an intermediate position in Colombia that has been seen as something bad, but we want to restate that it's important to not only, it's not about not having an opinion, it's having an opinion about issues and not about people. It's about having opinions that are not set in stone, but that you can actually change your mind about someone or about their the political the policies and the issues that are being discussed. So this position of being able to connect and hear others is one recommendation that we are making for the media and also for opinion leaders that can have that role of allowing to connect different conversations. That's one key recommendation. The other one is to setting bridges between issues that can be less polarizing. So let's say if the environment is a less polarized conversation, why don't we start with that and open up the trust and the roads for making agreements about other issues that are more polarized. So that's one opportunity that we think the leaders on the environmental arena can push forward. Then there's other element, which is actively looking for people that think differently than yourself. That is something that we all can do, and we can avoid the echo chambers where we usually live in. They're comfortable, but the messages, they are really bad for us. They don't allow us to think clearly, and at the end, we all need a different opinion. So we are inviting people to talk about ideas, not only about people, and to make the discussions about policies that allow us to build a common agenda. Those are some of the recommendations, but we also have the total study in Movilizatorio's website. You can download it. We have it also in English and in Spanish. So if you want to learn more about this, there's like a full report available for anyone, and we are more than happy to have conversations with people within different sectors on how these recommendations apply for their work and for their vision of how to contribute to end polarization.
Thank you, Lina. I like that message of dialogue, of talking to people that don't necessarily share your same views, but talking about policies, seeing what unifies us as a society. And I just wanted to highlight what this study revealed is the fact that we are not as divided as we thought we were, and as other different actors portray us to be. And so I think that's the first step of bringing Colombia together, is that realization that we actually have a lot of things in common, and we have to work towards to that middle ground and that center.
Also because that feeling is very paralyzing. If we only think we are polarized, that's it. There's nothing we can do. And what this research shows us is that yes, there are some things in which we are polarized, but there is a lot that we can do. And that sense of possibility is something that we want to share, because we think it's important to create opportunities and to, as you're saying, open up the dialogue beyond that widespread idea. There's some things that we can actually
do. Yeah. Lina, thank you so much for your time. This was an excellent conversation. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation.